Let's dive in. Does that work?
Okay.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, listen, welcome everyone to our third and final webinar related to our 13th volume of SAPIR, which is focused on resilience. It's really an excellent issue. For some of our longtime readers and listeners, you might recall that a year ago, August, we flipped the script, so to speak. Rather than having our SAPIR editor-in-chief, Bret in the moderator's chair, he fielded questions from me. SAPIR, I'm the SAPIR Institute Director, Chanan Weissman, and he also fielded questions from many of you about his essay at the time on anti-Semitism. So today we're gonna bring that back, and for the next 40 minutes or so, I'll be in conversation with Bret about his excellent essay entitled "Democracy's Pessimism Paradox," and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So as you're listening to this conversation, and listen, if something sparks your interest, curiosity, etc., just please submit that question in
Or
the
or
Q.
rage and indignation.
Even better. And actually, with that, I'd be remiss if I didn't channel you, Bret, by saying like, if you got hardball questions, throw them over the plate. Bret can handle them. Don't be shy. I kind of want to see what's on people's minds. So, um, Bret, suffice it to say, I think your essay couldn't be more timely. Not just because we have an impending election here in the U.S., uh, but also because this year, 2024, is widely considered a landmark year for democracy, right? By some estimates, there are some 60 or so national elections in 8 of the 10 most populous countries. Some 2 billion people, or half the world's adult population, is eligible to vote. More than 4 billion people will be impacted by the results of all of these elections. And the next time we'll see this many elections in a given year, according to one account, is 2048. And that's when the US is going to turn 272, Israel is going to turn 100, and SAPIR will turn 27. So, so here's the question right out the gate. For governments to hold an election and for people to cast their ballot seems to me to be like actually an act of optimism, like a belief perhaps that their voice matters. So how do you square that notion, whether you agree with it or not, with that very first sentence of your essay, which is actually we're living in an era of democratic pessimism? And just maybe you can unpack what you mean by democratic pessimism for those who haven't yet had a chance to read your essay.
Well, if you haven't heard, the world is going to hell, and democracy is on its last legs. The planet is ailing and getting worse. Pretty much anywhere you turn, people feel um, uh, take a very bleak view of the future. Um, there's a lot of data that shows this. People are losing faith in democracy. They only 42% of Americans think that their kids will lead better lives than they do. That number was 71% at the turn of the century. Various think tanks report the diminishment of political freedom around the world. Civil liberties aren't what they used to be in many democracies. Some would argue in the United States. And here in America, of course, many people feel that the possibility of a second Trump presidency could put our democracy at risk in light of January 6th. I'm just trying to be scrupulously even-handed here. Some of Trump's opponents feel that democracy is actually being put at risk by the other team. Efforts to kick Donald Trump off the ballot in Colorado, for example, or criminalize him before he's had a chance to run for president with a variety of charges. So the point is there's a lot of pessimism about the future of the world, but particularly about the prospects of democratic government. And what I say in my essay, it's 3 words: don't panic yet. And it's important to that my essay stress the word yet, because I don't want to sound Pollyanna in terms of the future of democracy. But I think there are reasons for us to be less pessimistic than I think some people often feel.
So, zooming out a little bit, I think you highlighted what the Stanford University professor Larry Diamond called this notion of a democratic recession, where freedom has declined globally for 18 consecutive years. I think another statistic, about 71% of the world's population live in autocracies, and that's actually an increase from 48% from 10 years ago. Now that's the world stage. And I think promoting like democratic norms and institutions and values has always been a core element of many presidents, including the current one. In fact, when I was in the Biden White House, he oftentimes talked about, he prioritized protecting democracy abroad and strengthening it at home. And yet internally, according to like a recent Pew poll, 72%, I'm astounded by this, 72% of Americans say the US used to be a good example of democracy, but isn't anymore. And so the problem, it appears, is that we don't even believe that we're that shining city on a hill anymore, which is a problem, because how can we promote the virtues basically of a system that a majority of our own citizens believe we're not actually the exemplars of?
So it helps to have a little bit of historical perspective. I suspect there are people on this call, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon's resignation, who remember the 1970s and remember that there was also a great deal of pessimism about the United States, about democracy at home, and the prospects for democracy worldwide around the time of that resignation. If you had a longer memory, if you went back, say, to the 1930s, same kinds of pessimism. The 1880s, the so-called Gilded Age, also a great deal of pessimism. One of the people I quote in my essay was a Massachusetts historian, well known in her day, named Mercy Otis Warren, who said, here I'm quoting from the essay, "We shall soon see this country rushing into the extremes of confusion and violence." What year did she say that? 1788. Why? Because she was opposed to the new Constitution, and she thought that it would lead to a disaster. So the starting point is, if you're feeling bad about the country and about its prospects and about democracy, just know that this is not historically unique. And in fact, there are a bunch of reasons why, in particular, people living in open societies might be more prone to pessimism than people living in more closed or autocratic societies. And I tried to list, and I'm just going to go through them just very briefly, a few of those reasons, Chanan, why that is. One of them is not only do we when we live in open societies, we live in societies that have, what you might call information abundance, right? The very nature of an open society means that a lot of people are talking openly about a lot of problems in the media or social media or other forums. But it's not just abundance, it's also asymmetry. You have never read a headline in a newspaper, I am sure, that says most things are slowly getting better. But in fact, if you kind of look at the last 250 years of history, most things have slowly been getting better. Generally speaking, we are living longer, healthier, more fulfilling, certainly much richer lives than we ever had in the past. Now, like the stock market, when you look at it closely, the indicators sort of seem to swing wildly, but if you sort of draw a broad line, you see that things are getting better. And that's because open societies emphasize the negative. Negative information attracts more interest and generates more discussion, gets better ratings than positive information. It's human nature, and it's human nature that is accelerated in an open society where we can play, where news media tends to play to our fears just more often than it does to our hopes. Another reason is that in open societies, democratic societies, right, people speak in hyperbolic terms, right? I mean, I remember when George W. Bush was the worst president we had ever had, and the United States had never been in worse shape. But then you go back to the Reagan administration and you read what was written about Reagan, same thing. Ditto, by the way, on the other side for what Republicans were saying about Bill Clinton in a period of unmatched peace and prosperity in the United States, or other administrations. So our rhetoric tends to tell us that, to lead to statements like, it's not just bad, it's never been worse. Third aspect is that in dynamic societies, right, societies where there is constant change, the very fact that there's a lot of change opens up a human instinct, which is loss aversion. And if you've read Daniel Kahneman's book, with Amos Tversky, that loss aversion is a much more powerful human instinct than the desire for gain. So we're constantly remembering how it was great back in the 1990s or 1950s, or name your halcyon period of the past. And the final point, I know I'm going on too long, but the final point is a certain kind of naivete. When what closed societies excel at, society like China excels at showing us their strengths and hiding their weaknesses. When I was growing up, the Soviet Union would have these big May Day parades, and we would see all their nuclear weapons, and it was a show of strength. What we didn't see were the long lines and the at stores and the empty shelves. In open societies, we do precisely the opposite. We advertise our weaknesses and we hide our strengths. And so it makes that paradox makes us look at other societies and say, geez, I wish we could be China for we could be like China or some other more closed society. It could have been Japan also in the 1980s. So that's another aspect. And the final thing is, in democratic societies, people don't like the idea that they're responsible for their own fate, that agency lies within and not in someone else's hands. So those are some of the factors which make democracies, almost by their very nature, prone to a kind of pessimism that is often unwarranted by the entire set of underlying facts.
What you're saying kind of reminds me of Winston Churchill's quip, and I think it was him. Most things are attributed to him or Lincoln. I have no idea whether he actually said it, but that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the rest. And I oftentimes think about, is it just possible we don't realize how potentially good we have it by historical standards? I remember when I was at the State Department, I had a meeting with a Croatian member of parliament. She was visiting, this was during the Trump years. She'd been traveling throughout the US for a conference, and this was her first time in the country. So at the end of the conversation, I asked, okay, so what's your top line takeaway from visiting the US? I remember she paused to think about it, and she goes your freedoms. You can just sense that you have more freedoms in this country. So I was okay, well, how precisely can you tell? And she said, you don't notice it because you're surrounded by it, but there's just this sense of freedom that's hard to explain, that you don't necessarily feel in other countries. So, is it possible we just don't realize how good we have it now, or is it no? There are actually some real problems that we need to address.
So I grew up in Mexico City, and as a child, every 6 months or so, we would get in our station wagon. This was a car that existed in the 1970s. We'd get in our station wagon.
I read about it on Wikipedia.
Yeah. And we would drive up along these endless, very narrow roads, 2-lane roads, where to get ahead of, you'd always have to risk your life going around slow moving trucks. And we'd end up in McAllen, Texas. And when I think of heaven, that childish sense, for some reason it's McAllen, Texas. Now, if you actually visit McAllen, Texas, it's not exactly the most picturesque town in America, right? And no offense to McAllen, they're nicer places. But the reason is that in growing up in a what I guess you would call a developing country like Mexico, also an autocratic country like Mexico was at the time, you see things about the United States that Americans just simply take for granted. As you say, it's completely invisible to most Americans. So for instance, drinking water from the tap and not fearing for your gastric health, right, uh, struck me as totally miraculous. Going to a movie that didn't have a 30-minute intermission, which was a propaganda film for the ruling party, the PRI at the time, that seemed also completely incredible. So many aspects of American life, which we simply have stopped thinking about, strike others as miraculous. And I'll give you one more example. About 15 or so years ago, I was in Egypt and I was interviewing one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. This guy had been a student, I think a chemistry student at a state university in Missouri, as I remember, in his youth. At any rate, I asked him, what was it that struck you about the United States? And he said that people stop at traffic lights. Now, anyone who knows anything about the traffic in Cairo can understand why he would be impressed by this. But what was also impressive, and I don't think he understood the full meaning of his comment, was that in a free society like America, right, people actually voluntarily obey things like traffic signals for the most part, right? In repressive societies like Egypt, actually people break the law all the time in all kinds of ways, because otherwise life is often unlivable. So again, it's one of these paradoxes where so much of what is right in America simply fails to be noticed by us. And one of the things I try to do in the essay is point out all the ways in which we have actually outperformed in the last 20 odd years.
That is undeniably the case. And I think it's also really important to look at this through a broader historical context. Nostalgia is a profoundly powerful force. And we oftentimes do think things were better in the past than they are now. Maybe things were better 8 years ago than they are today. I'm not 100% sure. But democracy, to your point, is also more than just free and fair elections. It's about like the active participation of citizens. It's about the protection of civil liberties. It's about what John Lewis said. I think that John Lewis in his final, former member of Congress from Georgia, said democracy is not a state, it's an act. And I'm just wondering whether, right, it's an acquired habit. It requires like the active. I'm wondering whether people are less engaged in the act of democracy now than they had been in the past, less involved in unions, less involved in their local community. And whether by extent there's a cynicism that we develop, and that cynicism then leads to apathy, and that apathy leads to disdain. And next thing you know, we are questioning whether the system in China is better than the United States, which is ridiculous.
Look, one thing I don't want people to take away from my essay is there's a lot that's going on in the United States. It's very upsetting, very disturbing. It's important to have a historical perspective that tells you that any American, any thoughtful American at nearly any point in time in our history, including periods we now look at as kind of high points in American life, would have said the exact same thing. The other thing that I think is important to note is that often when we talk about our fears for democracy, what we're really talking about is our fears for our view of democracy. So, tens of thousands of people are showing up to Donald Trump rallies, okay? Now, if you're opposed to Trump, you'll say, well, that's not democracy, that's mobocracy, or that's sort of some version of America that you don't recognize because it's saturated with racism and sexism and other things that one opposes, right? But that is democracy. People are showing up in fervent support for a candidate. And now I see Kamala Harris's rallies are equal, if not greater in size, to Trump's. That's also democracy. A lot of Republicans will say, well, that's just sort of the woke armies and so on. But those things are democracy. There is, in fact, incredible civic participation happening as we speak. Now, that's putting to one side our concerns about the platforms of either Trump or Harris. but it's hard to make the case that we're living in an era of civic disengagement. We might be living in an era of civic disenchantment, right? Which is different, right? In which you think, oh, the choices are lousy and I can't believe this is what I'm dealing with, or these candidates are so crass, or when I go on YouTube and listening to the speeches of past statesmen, it feels like we've declined so dramatically. There's a lot of disenchantment that happens, and that's a function of nostalgia. But there's, I think, unmistakably, and particularly in 2024, more engagement, more of a feeling that the stakes are high and you need to vote, you need to participate than there has been in a long time. You have to go back and recall the election of 1996, Bob Dole versus Bill Clinton. Boy, that was a snoozer. Okay, that was not exactly a high point of democratic engagement, even though in many respects the country was doing pretty well in 1996.
It's true. That's probably the most lackadaisical election in modern times in the United States. Do you Yashka Monk, he wrote this book several years ago called The Great Experiment,
Mhm.
as you recall. And he said that pessimism, which you highlight, takes a number of forms. On the right, there are fears about the impending doom of immigration and its effect on the demographic makeup of society. On the left, there's an abiding belief that the structural injustices in America not only define our past, but are going to define our future. So, one appears to be terrified about the progress that, quote unquote, progress that has been made, and the other is like apoplectic about sort of like the sclerotic nature of the progress. And you write about sort of this pessimism. I actually think it's really, really important, but I'm not sure if you answered the question, so I'm going to push you on this. You wrote pessimism is a motivator. At least you wrote pessimism, at least when it doesn't descend to fatalism, is a motivator, a spur to change, an invitation to personal or communal reinvention. To be convinced from one generation to the next that catastrophe lies around a corner, maybe both the cause and the result of a deep cultural neurosis, but it also goes far to nurture the virtues of a healthy society: self-questioning, experimentation, a willingness to adapt, an instinct for danger, relentless industry. That's my love language. That's fantastic. I completely agree with that. But then you write, should we
Interesting
be
love language, but go ahead.
okay? Well, I won't tell my wife, but I think she gets it. Should we be optimistic, you wrote, then about our pessimism? And I'm not sure you answered that question. What, or maybe you did, but what's your take? Should we be optimistic about this perpetual sense of pessimism that always underlies sort of healthy democratic societies because it can be utilized in a net positive way?
You know, America's been a perpetually pessimistic country, and the analogy I make in the essay is to the Jews. We are the ever-dying people, right? There has never been a generation of Jews that has not sort of thought, okay, we're pretty much the end of the chain, the end of the line. And it's that sense of pessimism, I think, in the Jewish people that explains a lot of the qualities of energy and self-reinvention and cultural dynamism that have kept the Jewish people alive these several millennia. I also think it's the same in many democracies, but there's an important distinction in that sentence, which I'm glad you noted. It's a great distinction between pessimism and fatalism, right? I mean, a pessimistic person thinks, oh gosh, I'm going to run out of money, or my kids aren't going to love me. Well, if you're not a fatalist, if you're a fatalist, you're going to just run out of money and alienate your children. A pessimist will say, "Well, I'm going to need to do something about that," right? And so there is a kind of a restlessness. This is what I talk about, the paradox of one of the paradoxes of pessimism in my essay, is that pessimism tends to be accompanied, not invariably, but often accompanied by a kind of a restless belief that if you don't act now, a kind of a catastrophe awaits. It's complacent organizations and complacent nations that run into danger. You know, one of the examples I offer is IBM. You know, if you're young and listening to this call, it may be difficult to understand that IBM once bestrode the world of American industry, much the way that Microsoft or Amazon do today. It was this absolute colossus. And in the 1980s, a very complacent IBM decided from its sort of lordly perch that it didn't need to develop its own proprietary software. It could purchase it from some little nothing company in Seattle called Microsoft, right? And essentially, IBM never recovered from that. You can look at other countries, moving from companies to countries. You can look at other countries that sort of took their supremacy for granted. For example, Great Britain 100 years or a little more, well, not 100 years ago, but say 120 years ago, right? Or I would argue China until quite recently, the Chinese leaders were convinced they were going to be the next great superpower. And then you see that they're making important mistakes that are consequential. So again, it is because we in America have this relentless pessimism that we, for example, managed to maintain about a 25% share of global GDP since the Kennedy administration. That's astounding.
Well, how do we make sure that the pessimism doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy, though? That it doesn't lead to some form of fatalism that, you know, condemns us to the worst imaginations that we might have?
Well, first of all, it helps not to screw up. You know, you've got to make good decisions. Pessimism has to lead to good decisions. But you know, the most important issue here, and I think probably I didn't get into this in the essay, and maybe this is for a future occasion. But one of the things that makes democracy special is that, you know, we are masters of our own destiny. I mean, part of democracy is accepting that by having a vote, you're responsible for your own destiny. There is a concept in psychology called the internal locus of control, which is contrasted with the external locus of control. The internal locus of control basically says, well, do you think that your decisions will shape or be decisive for the shape of your future, right? Anyone who believes in an internal locus of control understands that luck and circumstance play a part in life, but that ultimately control rests within, right? I think Israel is a country that historically has always had a strong sense of an internal locus of control. The decisions that Israel makes for itself will be the ones that lead to its flourishing or to its destruction. Americans, generally speaking, have had an internal locus of control. We've had so individually, culturally, and I think politically. Countries that tend to fail have an external locus of control, like the phrase "inshallah," you know, God willing, right? Or any other expression where it's in someone else's hands. The idea that whatever happens at any moment is largely in the hands of some other power. Okay, and where it's not just a figure of speech, but a deeply held belief that you will profit provided the king or the sultan or whoever does X, one thing or another. Those are countries that tend to be passive and fatalistic. And they are, if you look around the world, you will find that those countries where there's an external locus of control, where people feel they're either powerless or they're victims to circumstance, victims to fate, are ones that are going to fail. In many of these countries, people, you know, maybe they're by nature optimists, but they don't believe in taking charge of their own fate. And the key for the United States, to answer your question, is whether we maintain that strong sense of an internal locus of control, that we believe that if we see circumstances that are adverse or dire, we can actually affect the change that we seek.
I love that. And actually, I want to build on that for a second, in part because listen, at the end of the day, SAPIR is a journal of ideas for a thriving Jewish future. So I want to bring in sort of that Jewish dimension that you highlighted with regard to Ravitovich's famous essay on being an ever-dying people. We always think we're the last generation. This is an ever-dying system. We think this system's about to collapse. Actually, it actually reminds me of the famous Jewish joke, right? What's the difference between a pessimist and an optimist? The pessimist says, it can't possibly get any worse than this. The optimist says, of course it can. But this notion of no longer wanting to be a victim to fate, of like strengthening that internal locus of control, I think is in part why the Jewish community now is, at least in the last 15 years, 20 years, up until, let's say, pre-October 7th, felt like we were in the strongest possible position because of two things. Because of the Jewish state, and a Jewish state was able to maintain its destiny by making decisions for itself and as a center of power in the broader geopolitical landscape, including for Jews, and because we were able to operate in a system, in a democracy like the United States, where we can utilize our voice, as all individuals and groups can do, and maintain a certain degree of control over our fate by actively engaging in society, by actively engaging in governance. But here we are with this notion that perhaps there's a perception of democracy's demise. So, or there's I think it teeters between pessimism and fatalism sometimes. So what do you think the implications of the perception of democracy's demise will be on the Jewish community here in the United States, a community for whom this governance model was so sacrosanct for so long because it allowed us to maintain a certain internal locus of control?
Look, so now we're getting into the sort of the final note of my essay, which is don't panic yet, because there are trends in American society, leave alone around the world, let alone around the world, that do concern me, and concern me particularly with respect to us Jews. You know, one of them is this, that one aspect of what's happened in American democracy, at least in the last decade or so, is that increasingly the center of American politics, whether it's center left or center right, has been bending toward the fringe, whereas historically it was the fringe that bent towards the center, right? It used to be that if you wanted to be seen as a respectable person in politics, you moderated your positions. Nowadays, people who know better, right, will vote in a more extreme way because they're bending to the fringe. A great example for me for that is Lindsey Graham voting against aid to Ukraine, right? No one is more committed than Lindsey is to standing up for the Ukrainians. It's been his whole life's work, but all of a sudden it became an unpopular view in the Republican Party thanks to Donald Trump. So he was bending towards the fringe. And American Jews, I think, even although, you know, we've had our feet sometimes in radical politics. I mean, I had a great uncle who died with a poster of Marx and Lenin on his, Marx and Engels on his wall. American Jews have been essentially at the center of politics. So as political parties have moved the Republican Party in a much more nationalistic direction, elements of the Democratic Party in a much more progressive direction, it has stranded Jews. I mean, notice that almost all of the prominent never Trump Republicans, whether it was Stevens or Kristol or Jonah Goldberg, you know, you name it, it was heavily, I would say, overrepresented by a lot of Jews who wanted a Republican Party kind of in the mold of more centrist Republicans. And you find a lot of Democratic Jews very worried about the increasing anti-Israel tilt of some of their more progressive colleagues, and not just anti-Israel, but, you know, sympathetic to expressions that strike us as anti-Semitic, like from the river to the sea, are anti-Semitic in my view. And so that is one thing that I think deeply worries me. The second thing, and this is what I get at in the essay, is that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And anti-Semitism is not just a disease, it's also a symptom. It is a symptom that something has gone wrong with the software of liberalism. I mean liberalism in the classical sense, like democratic liberalism or liberal democracy. To be an anti-Semite is definitionally to be a conspiracy theorist. So conspiracy theorists are, again, definitionally operating in an irrational sphere. To be an anti-Semite is to believe that dark powers control the course of life, and that there's an external locus of control, and it's a wicked external locus, and those people are Jews. So anti-Semitism becomes a symptom of things that are ailing, that are a kind of a disease of the liberal democratic mind, that something is wrong there. And as anti-Semitic views have come up, by the way, I should say on both sides, whether it's those campus protesters and their anti-Semitic chants, or right-wingers who are talking about globalist cabals seeking to replace hardworking Americans with, low-cost Hispanics or whatever. All of these views are dangerous, not just to the Jews, they're dangerous to the very fabric of liberal democracy.
Yeah, and at its core, I think what you're also hitting upon is what Deborah Lipstadt, the current special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, said in the pages of SAPIR last year in the anti-Semitism issue, which is that the prevalence of anti-Semitism is sometimes a canary in the coal mine, the future of democracy, not a direct quote, but it's sometimes an indication that there's some element that's chipping away at the edifice of democracy in our country.
Yeah, Deborah's absolutely right. And if you look historically, when anti-Semitism starts rearing its head, democracy becomes increasingly shaky. Now, I also think, just to leave on a note of pessimism before we start taking questions, if that's what we're going to do. We are not here in the United States in the 248th year of our liberty and our independence. We are not Yeltsin's Russia. We are not Weimar Germany. We are not some shaky nascent or Orban's Hungary. Okay, we're not some shaky nascent democracy that where most of our cultural instincts actually move in authoritarian directions. Our democratic history is riddled with moments of profound democratic pessimism and doubt and genuine crisis, by the way. We had a civil war in this country. Terrible things have happened that have really tested our democracy far more severely than we're being tested now. And so I really have an abiding faith that the liberal democratic instincts in the United States remain incredibly powerful, that when people encounter, say, cancel culture, they start new forms of media, new institutions. When people are dissatisfied with their politics, they look for new political choices. There's much more dynamism in our economy than we think. If you look at some of the greatest achievements in the world today, almost everything ends up being made in USA. Again, we've had 20 years of democratic pessimism, and we never stopped to think that we invented, commercialized, and dominated all the important digital innovations of our time, that we flew a satellite past Pluto, that we became the world's largest energy producer, that tens of millions of people want to come here, aren't trying to leave here, that we won basically half the world's Nobel Prizes since the year 2000, that we gave birth to 60% of the world's biggest companies, including 8 of the top 10 largest companies by market cap, from Alphabet to NVIDIA, although I have to look at NVIDIA's stock price today. So there is incredible resilience and dynamism both in our politics and in our economy and society. We just have to stop and notice it.
Excellent. I want to now go to some of the questions that have come through. If you don't want me to mention your name, just write anonymous. Otherwise, I'll mention your name, and we'll get to a few of these in our remaining 15 minutes or so. So let's start with Lisa Levine. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who writes, you mentioned that we have difficulty in recognizing our freedoms and, I might add, the blessings that are afforded us in this country. How can we help to provide a perspective on these positive aspects of our life in the US to our young generation who are being indoctrinated to many negative views of our culture?
Yeah, it's a terrific question from Lisa, and it's something that worries me too, because it is difficult to sustain a free society when so many people are being raised to hate it, right? Or not to even understand exactly what kind of system we have, how it works. I think people right and left agree that the decline in civic education and awareness is a major problem. I think also, however, that it is an elite problem. You know, I keep talking about this, but I gave a talk at Grand Mesa University in Grand Junction, Colorado, about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago. And nothing made me more optimistic about young Americans than that encounter in a university that, let's face it, many of us have never heard of, right? Where you encounter the hatred of America is in Morningside Heights and in Berkeley and other institutions that have outsized importance in the culture, but they're not necessarily going to be the dominant or maybe the decisive factors in American life going forward. I mean, I you know, if I had the chance to run, say, Columbia University, a course on American civilization with an emphasis on how much we have done to make the world a better place despite our many imperfections, that would be on my list. But at the same time, I just don't think that these institutions are quite as important as we think. And I might add, speaking Jewishly, you know, quite as important as we think, because so much of our life or our aspirations have been defined in the last couple of generations by just a handful of elite places.
There's an anonymous wrote the following. Bret spoke about.
But wait, can I add one more point to Lisa's? Just one more thing.
Please, go ahead.
I wish every American would have the chance that I did, which is to spend a significant time of your life in another country, particularly assuming it's not Sweden or the Netherlands or some basically nice European country. Go to a third world country, see how things really work in those countries, see the cruelty and the sadness that typifies so much of life, the absence of things that we consider totally normal, from fresh running water to a stable electric grid and all these kinds of things, and then come back to the United States and tell me what a terrible place this is. I bet those kids wouldn't do that. Maybe mandatory Peace Corps would be a good idea.
I also think mandatory Peace Corps, perhaps in the United States, is not a crazy concept as well. Just getting out of our own communities to get a sense of what it's like outside before college. Anonymous asks, Bret spoke about new models, new media. What are the implications of big money on establishing or undermining those platforms as models of anti-democratic sentiment or undermining the market? So for example, Peter Thiel and Gawker, or Elon Musk and Twitter, or former President Trump and Truth Social.
Look, it takes money to start to start media, people have, especially when you're at the startup phase, you have people have financial backers because we journalists, writers, editors, also have families to raise and bills to pay, and that's just a reality. Some of this money might strike us as too big, but it takes money to do that. And what I think matters isn't the money. What matters is that there should be a diversity of voices being represented. So it's not all Elon Musk on one side, or pick your wealthy left of center philanthropist on the other. What really matters is that people feel on many sides of the or many points on the ideological spectrum that they want new voices being heard and showcased. And there's no doubt that a lot of this is just dreadful. Okay, that's in the nature of any free society. The production of dreck is what free societies do. But hopefully, amid that production, amid all that dreck, you have a few jewels, a few gems, a few promising startups, like I would say this little magazine.
Yes. Okay, we'll do a few more, and then I think we'll wrap. So some of this might get into the local political dynamics here in the United States, but that's par for the course given the environment. So Joanne Coffin says, participation in the democratic process via voting may not result in democracy in the future. So, for example, Trump's policies on one hand, and what she says I view as Vice President Harris's soft anti-Zionism unrolling the beginnings of fascism on the other. Joanne wants to know whether her fears are unwarranted.
Well, they're not unwarranted. I think it was Niels Bohr once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. So I don't know what exactly the future is going to bring, but I do know that participating in the democratic process is a better way of ensuring a democratic future than not participating in it. My own views, I think, are well known. I think we don't have great political choices this season. That's the understatement of the century. But I do think that, for instance, if you are a Democrat and you are concerned about what Joanne says, or Harris's soft anti-Zionism, then that's all the more reason as a Zionist Democrat to become that much more engaged in the process. We're going to learn tomorrow, for example, whether Cori Bush is going to win her primary race in her seat. If she doesn't win, and I'm not a great fan of hers, if she doesn't win, it's because Democrats and Jewish Democrats decided that her openly pro-Hamas views had no place in the Democratic Party. And I would like, as someone who's on to the right of center, to also maintain some kind of idea of what conservatism ought to be, because I often feel that what used to be my party, the Republican Party, has been taken from me by ideological interlopers. And that makes me want to engage more in a conservative argument about what a healthy conservative movement and Republican Party ought to look like.
Right. And listen, I'd be remiss if I didn't quibble a little bit with the notion that Vice President Harris has an a soft anti-Zionist outlook. I think she's an incredibly strong supporter of the Jewish state, has been for years, though I know that there's some concerns. And we'll see who she selects, I think, in the next day or so as her vice presidential counterpart in the upcoming ticket. Okay, let's do one or two more questions.
Well, if she selects Cori Bush, then I think you should be concerned, but we'll see.
If she selects Cori Bush, yeah, I'll give you $100. All right. So Barry Wolf says, the indoctrination taking place within our school system is teaching nothing about what is unique and good about the U.S. America became great because of individual competition. Our educational system today is one of left-wing. What is wrong with America indoctrination? Do you believe that school choice, so we're getting into the nitty-gritty policies, do you believe that school choice needs to be a priority for our nation's future through parental choice?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a great supporter of school choice, and I believe also that we should have school choice that is open to religious schools. You know, having been a parent in the New York City public education system, it's incredibly depressing what has happened to these schools, and it's even more depressing to think of what happens to children who didn't have the same financial options as my children did to go to better private schools when the public schools really started failing. And the amount of naked political indoctrination that is happening in so many schools around the country, particularly public schools, is absolutely appalling. I think of at its most extreme forms in Oakland with a so-called liberated ethnic studies curriculum that has been adopted by some of the public schools there, but a lot of sort of soft political indoctrination happening in sort of other more run-of-the-mill public schools. I will say this to Barry, which is that this is a point that probably could have been made decades ago. And I don't mean to suggest that it's not a serious issue, but it's not a new one. And it makes me wonder, well, you know, if this has been going on for so long, why have we, you know, survived it? And it's because I think there's something in America's cultural DNA that is able to resist and overcome a lot of the indoctrination. You know, I find just talking to my children, especially my 19-year-old son who's been exposed to some of this stuff. Now, granted, he's my son, so this is not a representative sample, but he kind of sort of shrugs his shoulders and tells me, along with his friends, that people kind of listen to it with a lot of healthy all-American skepticism. I think part of American culture is that South Park attitude of gleeful indifference to reigning ideological sensibilities.
I just want to note that in our forthcoming issue of SAPIR, we will have someone make the case for religious charter schools. So please be on the lookout for that. One last question, Bret, from an anonymous attendee. Some thought that museums like the Weissman Museum in Philadelphia, which showed Jewish contribution to America, were too boastful and, quote, not Jewish. And yet others see this as an expression of how grateful we should be and not how great we are. Can museums like Weissman help our community and those outside our community be part of the solution?
So I didn't see the exhibit, but I'm stealing an idea from Lou Weiss, Barry Weiss's dad, who's loves to talk of himself as a carpet salesman from Pittsburgh. He's so much more than that, although he's not a bad carpet salesman apparently. But Lou has the idea that what we need is a traveling museum of Jewish ideas. That too much of what goes by kind of Jewish life or the relationship of Jewish museums to the broader American public is filtered through the lens of the Holocaust. And obviously the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, but various other in Washington, but various other kinds of memorials. And I think that instinct is right. I mean, it would be good for ordinary Americans today. And this goes back, by the way, to Barry Wolf's previous questions. It would be a great thing if ordinary Americans today had the same appreciation of the Jewish contribution to civilization that our American forebears did. You know, John Adams, a great philo-Semite, said something to the effect that no nation has contributed so much to the advancement of human civilization as the Hebrew nation. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of the quote. Mark Twain was a great admirer of the Jews. Historically, Americans who had any sense of the kind of broad contours of our civilization knew how much Jews had given. And that's just not true today. I think maybe because Jews have overemphasized the Shoah as the defining aspect of our identity. So how about, the weekend? You're welcome. One of the great Jewish contributions to civilization. The idea of a freedom-seeking people, universal literacy, argument for the sake of heaven. The very concept of peoplehood as a locus of identity between the individual and the state. So much that the Jews have given our common civilization that just is simply unappreciated by the wider public. And I think it's particularly important because there are aspects, there are trends in American Jewish life, people in American Jewish life, who basically want to say that today we need our place at the table of American victimhood, and that in a sense the new anti-Semitism gives us a right to stake our claim to being American victims as African Americans are, or Indian Americans, or rather Native Americans, and so on. I think that's an incredible mistake. I think what we should be saying is we have contributed mightily to a set of ideas that makes our common democratic life livable, prosperous, and strong. And you should know what those contributions are. And that the best solution to anti-Semitism is going to be Jewish pride and showcasing how much we've contributed not only to American life, but to human flourishing for thousands of years.
Amen, amen. Last barn burner of a question. All those years ago, when you sat in that station wagon, did you get to sit in the back seat? Were you allowed to do that, or were you in the middle seat?
No. Usually I was in the bed in the back, and sometimes my dad, if we were driving slow, would pull down the back window, and we could sit and hold on to the handlebars above, which was really bad parenting, but it was the kind of bad parenting that made growing up in the 1970s much more enjoyable than it is today. And I think of my late father with infinite love and gratitude for raising me the way he did.
And I'm sure he had great pride in you and deep appreciation for this really thought-provoking essay, Bret.
Can I answer this one quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So I just noticed Allison Wexler Cipriani was asking a hard question. Why did it feel it was my place to call for the resignation of our democratically elected PM in Israel? Seems like it's not his place to call for the downfall of a leader of a democracy. Justification, question mark. My answer is, it's a free country. I'm an opinion columnist, and I offer opinions. And if the prime minister wants to take me up on the suggestion, I would urge him to do so. And if he doesn't, the people of Israel will elect whomever they see fit.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Bret, deeply appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone as well for joining us over the last hour. Our forthcoming issue, should we say what it's on, or should we hold tight?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, so our forthcoming issue will be on faith. And so, encourage everyone to check out sapirjournal.org over the next several days. We're really excited about this issue, especially in the lead up to the high holidays, but it's not just going to be about sort of a traditional conception of faith. It'll be looking at, faith in institutions, faith in Jewish institutions. What does it mean to be a Jewish atheist? What does it mean to believe in God, et cetera? So I have faith in our democratic future, and I appreciate you, Bret, for taking the time to write this essay, and everyone else for joining. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a great, great day.
Thanks for joining the conversation.
Be well. Bye.